How long is this? I'm sorry.
It's about to be an hour, but we can cut it.
An hour? Okay,
It's
all right.
I mean,
Rex, I may need a drink.
We've
Okay.
never had problem talking.
Okay, no, I haven't, but I've not been taped before.
All right, can I, what's your name?
I'm Janet Britton. I would tell you if you were a really close friend that my middle name's Lorene, but I don't tell other people that.
And what have your jobs been throughout your life?
Well, I've been a waitress.
Mm-hmm.
I've done a shipping department, being a secretary there. I've worked in a library, but then when I got my degree, I've been a teacher, English teacher. I call it reading and writing, because English teacher, they always have red marks on their hand from marking up editing papers. I use green pencil too, because I didn't want to have red.
And you're also a published writer.
I am. I write.
About anything in particular?
I've written, to be published, I've written a lot of articles for magazines. A lot about, I wrote originally about having breast cancer, because I was 32, 33, and wrote that for my children. And it ended up getting published, and I ended up living in, so the kids aren't as impressed as the other people that have read it. So it was more for other people's families. I reissued that with a friend who had breast cancer. You know this, right? The Emily Compton, the basketball coach for our local school, the wife of the basketball coach, she got breast cancer at 33 a couple years ago when our granddaughter was in the basketball team. Everyone was just devastated. She has twins, 18-month-old twins, a 4-year-old, a 5-year-old, and it was just like, you know, deja vu, everything just crashing back. Being young, being kind of in the public, when you're in the school situation, you're in a public situation. And all the rumors and all the concern. And so I put out an edition. Largely I started with the Kindle version so that people would actually read it, because young people don't like books, you know, things. So I put that out first, and with the intro and the conclusion explaining the differences that in treatment in the 30-some years that have passed, but the similarities, I mean, the emotional problems, those kinds of things remain the same no matter what the technology is. So I did that one, and I have a novel that the agent supposedly was placing, and he hasn't got that done. And it was about inside Cinderella's castle, how what we perceive from the outside is the perfect marriage, but what's really going on inside. Okay, those kind of things. All right, relationships.
So, have you always lived in the country? Did you spend any time abroad?
I grew up in Jamestown, Pennsylvania, and then ended up clear across the border in Andover, Ohio. How many miles is that? 15? 10? But in between time, I went to school in New York, in the city, and well, I graduated in Maine, but we lived overseas in Turkey for a while.
And why were you in Turkey?
It was Vietnam War era. Everyone was in the military someplace, and my husband was stationed in Turkey.
What was your husband's branch in the military?
He was in the Air Force.
And what exactly were his responsibilities? What did all that consist of?
He was in the air police, the military police, and he was a dog handler. He went to Germany and got trained and brought a dog back in Turkey. And there, this was during the Cold War, and so Russia, you had the Straits in Istanbul. I mean, it was right with the USSR. And so at the time there was the missiles is what they used. And so they had missile pads that they guarded. They said that Gary Powers, does anyone remember Gary Powers? A U-2 spy pilot that was brought down in Russia, and there was a big spy thing going on, that he flew out of the base that Rex was in. Rex is my husband.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and you said you were stationed in Turkey, but it was during the Vietnam War. Those are kind of far apart.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain that a little bit more?
Well, there were a lot of things going on in the 60s. Would you like me to? No, that'll take more than an hour. But between all the problems on the home front with race and everything, all our riots and all our problems, and then a lot of the problems associated with the Vietnam War and that war, the guys were pulled out of college. I mean, so something like Nate, I mean, your whole world changes. You have to make decisions on the basis of, what major. If you get in education, maybe you don't have to get drafted. The whole thing with the lottery. So all that was going on in Vietnam, but at the same time we had the Cold War with Russia. And, we just had the Cuban Missile thing, which, so all these things, like, it's very much like today with you can't just pinpoint one area of conflict in the world. Mm-hmm. In the Middle East, we had just had the 6-Day War, which at the time, I thought, what's the big deal about a 6-day war, But that whole gathering of territory and changing the map in the 60s is still where we are fighting over in the Middle East. The inability to come up with boundaries that both sides agree on. So the Middle East was a hot spot. The Cold War with the USSR were also big issues at the time.
Mm-hmm. What were your experiences like being specifically an American woman in Turkey at that time?
Well, that's another hour. A woman in Turkey, and from what we read and hear, in a Muslim country, the status of women is very low. So then if you're an American woman, Americans were viewed as having no morality. And one of the things, if I were the President of the United States or in Congress, I would work at the kinds of movies that we export. We went to the movies with the landlord, our Turkish landlord, and I was appalled at the portrayal of Americans. They were sending our film majors at B-list, the B-list movies, that over there, things that, we'd never seen, but they would portray women as, in the movies that we saw, first thing is just the wealth of America, that everybody in America has these big mansions. I can remember this one scene, this woman coming down a staircase. It was so bogus. But it's the idea that we have wealth, we have no values as far as morality, that we're loose. So any woman was seen as loose, and if you were with, even with your husband out on the street, you were a target. I had a friend who was coming with her husband and her baby to our house, and just walking down just a little road between our apartments, and two businessmen were coming along, and they were talking, and Barb and Tom were talking, and Tom had the baby, and they got close, and one of the guys just grabbed Barb and just started biting her all over the face. It was a disrespect thing. And it wasn't like they were low-class people, but it was just simply that she was a woman, and, the other Turkish man actually broke things up because he pulled a knife on Tom and all this stuff. But it's the attitude towards women. And Barb was young, very pretty, you know, but you didn't have to be young or pretty. You could be an old slob. You're a woman, you know.
So would you say it was a bigger problem for being a woman versus a man, or an American versus a person?
A woman. Because women, Turkish women too, I mean, it's a problem being a woman. I know one of the things that my husband wouldn't tell me, but the girls, the women, the girl talk, and Rex eventually talked about it, is that they had legalized prostitution, which would be like, and I don't know if that would still be the case, I'm curious now they're saying it, but like if a man committed a crime, he could send his daughter or his wife or his sister to what they called the pound, the compound, and work out his sentence as a legalized prostitution there. The military guys would, you know, knew all about that. But, you know, that attitude that you could just send one of your women. Women, like the landlord's wife, and, you know, I have friends with some of the women in the apartment, and the men, they went out, they did their thing, but the women had to stay home. You know, so that was just to be a woman in Turkey. Even the ones that appeared to be westernized in their dress and had more freedom in education in their dress, they still didn't have freedom in their personal lives. Oh, and smoking. I love this because when I go out with the Turkish women, everyone smoked, you know, but women weren't allowed to smoke. And so hiding in an alley, and so we'd stand there so that no one would see, and they'd have a cigarette. I mean, you know, like that was the big rebellion with this American woman, and, you know, I would be their scout, make sure no one caught them smoking.
You said that Americans were targeted. Were you ever the subject of any targeting? And if so, was it just because you were American, or?
Yeah. My husband's favorite story is when we were, there was an Italian carnival, you know, they had, you know, rides. And one of them was the Dodgem cars. And of course there, women weren't allowed to drive in Turkey. And I'm sure they are now, but they weren't then. And the men, very few drove because, you know, they had horses and buggies, and, you know, they walked, you know. But so these Dodgem cars were like this big, exciting thing. And so several couples of us went, and we went down, and of course we women could handle a Dodgem car, you know, because we drove. So the men who despise women anyway, to be shown up by a woman, and then an American woman. So anyway, the owner of the Dodgems kept us. We rode, I don't know, an hour. We rode free because he was drawing all this business. Well, then when we left, now we have two versions of this story. When we left, the guys started getting us through the crowd, and they started throwing gravel at us, you know, just picking up things, throwing at us. Now, my husband, who is always much more positive than I, said, well, they just didn't want us to leave. I think they just hated us and were trying to smash our brains out. But anyway, we got out of there. The guys got us through there. But like, we were young, I think probably now I might be more cautious about going out, but then I wasn't going to be a prisoner. And so we would try to get out more often, but just to walk down the streets, the way it was when you were with you would go in couples, and then when people would be coming towards you, then the women would go in the middle, and one guy would be in your back, one by the front, so that they could keep people from pinching you or grabbing you, you know. So the guys, and even then, you know, it was a problem. Just they thought, you know, any American woman was worth a pinch, squeeze, whatever.
Would you ever try to venture out alone?
Well, the answer to that is only a couple times when I was mad. A couple of us would get mad at our husbands, and we weren't going to be there. Barb and I had one particularly scary time, after that time, we never did again. It was too, but just to go out, I had dogs. We had puppies. My husband was a dog handler, and he found the neighbor, the little Turkish kids. Of course, they were entertained by Americans, and so they were all our buddies. But they knew, for some reason, they knew Rex liked dogs, and so they said, "Gel, gel," and they took him, and they found there were these little puppies that were abandoned, and so he brought them home, and we raised these dogs. But they were very helpful to me because Turks were so afraid of dogs that I could go out of the apartment, just out on the sidewalk and that with these dogs, and people would stay away from me if the dogs were there. But as soon as the dog, like the one time, there were these, in Turkey in those days, there was a milk woman, and she'd ride her donkey, and she would deliver milk to the Turkish families, and she would have like jugs, and she'd go and must just like pour them out of the jugs into their jugs in their house or something. She was one of my favorite people because she had gray hair, just solid gray, but she had these like braids under that were red. So sometimes she dyed her hair red, and then all of it had, anyway, you had to be there. And and then she had her little cap. So her cap, you could see this gray and then these red things sticking out. But so she delivered every day. There was a vegetable man that came around every day with a cart, and there were like pastry delivery boys. Well, and one of the problems you had with the Turkish people was that there was so much malnutrition, you couldn't tell the age of a person by their size. And this is one that I thought these delivery people were boys, but looking back, I realized they were older. They probably were at least in their teens, but the dogs they were delivering. I saw them all the time, so I wasn't afraid of them. But the dogs ran in, and we were in a basement apartment, and they had run down the stairs, and I was following them, and one of the guys, they probably had talked about it, it was a planned terrorist attack. One grabbed me by the top, one grabbed me in the bottom, and they started pulling me, and I started saying, "Kupek," and I said husband, every few Turkish words I knew, and threatening them, and they just laughed at me, and then, but I was very athletic when I was young, and somehow I twisted away and the only thing that saved me from them getting in the apartment was just that the dogs. I called them, and one of them barked, and they just hesitated a minute, and I got the door shut and locked and bolted. So it was in Turkey, everything was everything locked, bolted, barred windows. But can I throw in something not Turkey? Good. You have to say yes because I'm the talker, right? The thing is, I have this real thing about guns. I mean, people around here, oh no, we have to, our rights. And I see on Facebook, with Paris, well, this is the reason nobody's ever going to take away my guns. Like this guy, like he's going to open up fire on a bunch of terrorists with his little handgun that he has. I mean, I have trouble with guns are the answer because in Turkey, one of the things, I felt so safe in Turkey in one way. When I got in the apartment and I had bars and I had the bolts on the door, I didn't care if there were a whole riotous crowd outside my apartment. They didn't have guns. They weren't going to shoot me. And, my husband was always saying, yeah, but they'd slit your throat and they'd stab you. And they did do that. I mean, there was a lot of violence, and so the guys were saying they'd slit your throat as well as look at you. But again, I was pretty athletic. I said, let them throw a knife through my, my window. I can dodge it, but I can't dodge a bullet, So I think ignoring, there are so many factors, but, with living in a place where they didn't have guns, the guy pulled a knife on Barb and Tom, but he didn't just pull out an Uzi and blow them down. Right? So now with the terrorists and that, and going to the mall in Niles, you always are aware that people have guns. They can stop out here and shoot through my window while I'm sitting in my couch. And so Turkey gave me that sense of at least you could get away. You could have a place that felt safe because there were no guns. Okay, that's not anything to do about this interview, but I thought I'd throw it in.
No, it was good. Do you think the Muslim faith affected the Turkish society in any way?
Okay, Hannah. Whatever our faith or lack of affects all of a society, So, going from a world where, just like Christmas or Easter. I mean, you can be an absolute atheist, but in America, but it's still all around you. You still have, maybe you translate, instead of the resurrection of Christ, you have a bunch of little peeps or something, but it's still, the culture is very influenced by the faith. So their attitudes towards women, attitudes towards animals, attitudes towards children, to a simple thing that would be like safety, where a Christian, we protect the weak and the sick, and you have a responsibility for that. That's the Christian faith. With the Muslim faith, as it was practiced in Turkey, there was no, they didn't believe in safety precautions. All right, that'd be a simple thing, because if Allah wills it, it's going to happen. You wouldn't have safety barriers along the highway. You wouldn't have bread that was wrapped in cellophane. There weren't laws like once a bunch of rat poison got in bread, and they couldn't track it back to where it was, because they didn't have laws to protect the consumer, because if you're going to die of rat poisoning, if that was Allah's will, that was just Allah's will, so you don't worry about it. So that whole attitude towards safety precautions was very much affected. Is my husband allowed to put in what were you going to say? Oh, yeah. It would be, my husband never let me go see, we lived on the economy because he was under 4 years, so he was not, I was in Turkey as a private citizen. I could go on base, and the military would help, but basically I was living in Adana as a private citizen. So, my husband's, we had $8 for 2 weeks to live on. By the time we had paid our rent, we were madly in love, so we had to borrow money for the plane tickets to get me over there, to be there. So by the time we had $8, and that's how I fed us on $8. So we would get, like ekmek, the bread, it'd be like 2.5 cents. So yeah, it didn't have cellophane, it was covered with flies, but we ate things, if Allah willed it, we were in Turkey, we were dead, that was it. And you get the scoots or whatever, like I would buy the vegetables from the Turkish vendor, because, again, you're talking much less money than if you went on base. And so, oh yeah, if you we got the vegetables, but you had to soak everything in Clorox water. All water had to be boiled. it's a third world, country. So if some things you like, if you could peel it and skin it, you could eat it, But, well, in the same way, the meat on base costs too much. So the guys, I think Tom and Barb ate. A lot of the military people wouldn't eat what we ate, but Rex would go down to the meat market. And so the catches, again, what we would say basic sanitary, guidelines, there weren't any. And so they would go first thing in the morning because they would just hang carcasses and you would point to the part you wanted and they'd chop off the meat and wrap it up and there were flies all over it and there was no refrigeration. And so it was a different world. But I was a poor farm girl, so I knew quite a bit about how to cook things. We didn't die. Oh, but my favorite part of baking, we did get flour from the base, but even shipping it, because remember we're talking about a time when there was no there was no the communication. Shipping, we're talking about on a ship to get things. So by the time they would get the flour there, and then it's very, very hot over there, and we didn't have the refrigeration and stuff. So all the flour on base had those little flour weevils. I haven't seen them since they came back to the States. So where people would say, you aren't going to eat that, are you? Well, yeah, I just sifted out the weevils and then made whatever I was making. And I said, well, it's baked and you can't see the bugs. And, but that kind of thing, that was just, and everything, of course, milk had to be totally powdered because there wasn't fresh milk, unless I'd used the Turkish milk lady, but I wasn't really up to undulant fever. Undulant fever? Infected cows, you don't want it.
We, as American citizens to this day, we were told a lot about Muslim extremists and radical Islam, but was there anything like that in Turkey when you lived there? Any religious customs that were a daily reminder of just how different the American versus Turkish society was?
Everything, again, a whole culture permeated by, just go back, I started to say about Christmas and Easter, but there it was, and I'm not going to remember the names of them, but they had the sheep killing festival, and I can't remember what it was called. But once a year, they would kill the sheep, and then they were supposed to give the beggars, it was supposed to be an act of charity, so that you killed the sheep and you gave to the poor. I got from there that in every religion, there are probably more hypocrites than true followers of the faith. And so like our landlord, who was very strong Muslim, but that would be doing the sheep. I could even tell that he just chopped off some little grizzly thing and threw it to the people, and he kept the good parts for his family, which was not the purpose of the festival. Or he would when we would be places with Muslims, that there's in their faith, and I didn't understand it, they were not to drink one drop of alcohol. So Muslims aren't supposed to drink. Well, they would always have wine and offering things, and they would go like this. They would put their finger in and take one drop and throw it out and drink it. They weren't allowed to drink one drop. I thought, well, that's really cool. I mean, they could find a way around, just as we can. We can always find an excuse for why we don't follow what we know about caring for people around us. And so, of course, the constant reminder of being in a Muslim country is the call to prayer 5 times a day. I really got, so I liked that. It was from dawn till dusk. And I thought, well, if they can get down on their prayer rugs and and do a formal prayer, I guess I could at least remember 5 times a day to say thank you, Father, for something. So so I guess probably, I don't know, get me back on track. I'm Roman. I don't know what else.
No,
I mean,
that's
it's just
fine.
constant. I mean, you know, the whole world is, you know, the mosques, the prayer rugs, it's just the culture.
And what religion do you belong to?
I don't like the word religion. I have faith that there is a God, and that I believe in Christ being the Son of God. So I'm Christian. I believe you know the Christians by their love. So I know a lot of people that say they're Christians, but they don't love, so I don't believe they're Christians. How's that?
And how would you say the culture in Turkey for when you were in there, the 60s and 70s, compared to it now, and then compared again to modern America?
Wow, that's a long question. I don't think people basically change. I think that there are people who have a spirit of faith, and that in every decade there are those who live their faith and believe in loving their neighbors and making a difference in the world. And in Turkey, I didn't get to know intimately to have conversations about faith because I didn't speak the language except Kupek, Chokfana, you know, Merhaba. So you only went by the spirit of people, you know, but there were people who I believed had a strong belief in, you know, charity, caring for families, and there were a lot of violent hypocrites, which is what I'm seeing, more violent hypocrites in America than in the 60s. I think that the biggest change, I don't know about Turkey because I haven't lived there, but I see in America a big change in just basic values, like when I was saying loving children, loving women. I mean, look at the abuse in our families. That was not something. Every culture, every decade, there's been violence, but to accept the violence against women, what I see in the high school before I left, in a small high school, guys would not permit women to be disrespected in the 60s. Right, Rex? There's no one. I don't care how low class a girl was. No, the guys would not tolerate disrespecting, you know, abusing her, getting her drunk, and having sex with her. That would never, the guys would have stopped it. And this is one of the things that is not your answer to Turkey, but I think the change, I live here, and I see a big lack of the values that we say we believe in, respect, values, that we are not who we say we were, right? And even in Turkey, with the American military, we're in the 60s, we were by ourselves, but the men took care of, would protect a wife of another man in Turkey, American soldiers. You know, and I wonder, is that still the case? You know, would men stand up to their buddy to defend a woman because she is a woman, or a child? You know, so I see that big difference. Okay, so then Were there extremist groups in Turkey? Not that I knew of then. Turks, as a general case, didn't like Americans. But was it because of religion? I'm not sure. I think it was a lot economy. You know, the economy. We were the wealthy, we were the privileged. I think it was that kind of this dislike of Americans more than the Muslim Christian thing.
Do you think there's any correlation between the lack of respect in younger generations and the falling away from any sense of religion?
Now, I think we're talking a lot about religion in our decade, and we're not talking much about faith or a belief system, a value system. I think we're polarized in that. It's sort of the same thing maybe in the 60s that was, or 50s. I was young enough, I didn't see it. You call someone a communist, that was okay then to do whatever to them. We had some bad times in America. Or going back to the race, that in the name of race, we could ignore each other's humanity. I think now we're using religion, we're using Democrat, Republican. We label people, and then we don't have to treat them as human beings who deserve respect. So maybe I think there's, maybe even in Turkey, I think if we went back, we would find that it would be more the Christian-Muslim thing, that in the name of religion, but it's not really about anything about faith.
And is that why you said you don't like religion?
I have the trouble with people just labeling themselves. Have we lost the power? No, is the camera okay? Okay. I have an adult attention deficit, so if you move, I'm going to notice. Yes, it isn't. It's just in the name of religion what we do,